Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal while Brook Lynn remained haunted by the searing sting of betrayal, her fury toward Lulu had long evolved beyond a reaction to a single moment of indiscretion. It had become the slow-burning result of years spent living in the shadow of lies, in the suffocating silence of secrets she was never allowed to speak. The theft of her motherhood, the denial of her right to raise her biological son Gio, and the irreparable damage to his emotional life had all built into a quiet rage that now found its outlet in the form of meticulous vengeance. Yet, as Brook Lynn started digging into the concealed past of Lulu's seemingly perfect maternal record, she had not anticipated the sinister path she was about to uncover, one that would do far more than simply tarnish Lulu's reputation. It would fracture Rocco's entire perception of reality and unearth a truth that threatened to rip apart the fragile threads of a carefully constructed life. It began with a simple accident, or perhaps fate cloaked in coincidence. In the dim quiet of the Quartermain estate, while Brook Lynn was momentarily distracted in another room, Rocco stumbled upon a folder left open on her desk. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, perhaps just curious about the woman who had grown increasingly secretive and distant. But the moment his eyes landed on the top sheet, everything around him shifted. His name appeared in bold, followed by references to Britt and a string of terms that made his heart pound: gestational carrier, unauthorized embryo, substitution without consent. The clinical coldness of the language did nothing to muffle the roar in his ears. The words didn't make complete sense yet, but their implications struck him with primal force. He closed the folder, slipped it into his backpack, and walked away like a boy hiding stolen fire. That night, sleep eluded Rocco. His thoughts looped relentlessly. He recalled the times Dante had looked away when he'd asked about his early life, the subtle but recurring discomfort in Lulu's eyes anytime someone mentioned her pregnancy. There had always been something off, but he never questioned it. Not until now. Every memory now felt like it was hiding something. Each smile, every hug, every bedtime story from Lulu, were they all masking a lie? What if the woman who'd raised him, nurtured him, wasn't really who he thought she was? What if the foundation of his identity had been built on stolen ground? The questions grew louder when Britt returned to Port Charles, her presence unavoidable and tense. Her reappearance seemed almost too timely, as if summoned by Brook Lynn's escalating need for retribution. She arrived at Lulu's door with a tremor in her hands, her posture torn between guilt and defiance. The moment their eyes met, the past bled into the present. Lulu, once composed and unflappable, could no longer hold the line. The pressure from Brook Lynn's silent accusations, the weight of what Rocco may already suspect, and the gnawing guilt she had buried deep for so long. All of it collapsed in on her. And she broke. She confessed everything. Years ago, in a time swathed in desperation and secrecy, Britt had been working as part of a covert program at the hospital that involved experimental reproductive techniques. What began as a legitimate study on assisted conception had turned dark when Britt, burdened by emotional instability and unresolved personal trauma, used her access to genetic materials to implant herself with an embryo that wasn't hers by right. The embryo had been part of a confidential program involving Dante's sample and an unknown egg donor, marked for research only, not implantation. But Britt, believing she could make a life of her own outside the shadow of her father's crimes, stole it. The pregnancy was hidden, and when complications forced her to flee, she turned to Lulu, who had recently suffered the devastating loss of her own pregnancy and was shattered by grief. Lulu agreed to raise the child as her own, rationalizing it as a second chance from a universe that had taken too much. She promised Britt that she would give the boy love and stability. They agreed to sever contact, to bury the truth for the sake of the child. And for a time, it worked. Rocco grew up believing Lulu was his biological mother and Dante his father. He never knew that his origins were part science, part theft, and entirely built on the unstable foundation of a moral compromise made in silence. But now, standing in that room as Lulu sobbed through her confession and Britt turned her face away in shame, Rocco's world tilted into something unrecognizable. The walls of the home he grew up in no longer felt safe. The people he loved no longer felt familiar. His skin crawled with the knowledge that his very existence had been bartered like a secret deal between women too broken to choose a better path. The betrayal wasn't just in the lie, it was in the years of pretending the lie was truth. Brook Lynn, watching from a distance, thought she would feel satisfaction. Instead, all she felt was horror. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't predicted the devastation in Rocco's eyes, the way his voice had vanished, how he walked out without a word. Her plan had been to expose Lulu's hypocrisy, not to decimate a young boy's sense of self. But the line had been crossed, and there was no undoing it. As night fell over Port Charles, Rocco disappeared into its quiet corners, unreachable and alone with the truth that had shattered him. The boy who once believed he understood who he was now found himself spiraling through an identity crisis he had no words for. Britt sat in silence, broken, clutching a photograph of the boy she had abandoned. Lulu collapsed onto the floor, begging a god she no longer trusted for forgiveness. And Brook Lynn, the architect of this reckoning, stood alone in the aftermath, staring at the ruins of her vengeance and realizing that in trying to avenge her own pain, she had inflicted a wound even deeper onto someone who had no say in any of it. Lulu recalled that during a time when Britt was deeply entrenched in a clandestine fertility research program, one funded under the radar and operating far from the ethical boundaries of the hospital's main oversight. Britt made a decision that would ripple across lives for years to come. As part of her access to cutting-edge reproductive technologies, Britt had been privy to a collection of embryos gathered under a mix of legal and experimental contexts, some from donors who had consented under limited terms, others of more ambiguous origin. Among them was one embryo that had not been selected for transfer in any approved surrogacy or in vitro procedure. It was marked as unclaimed, unassigned, potentially to be destroyed. But to Britt, struggling with the weight of her own familial legacy and the shadows cast by her father Caesar Faison's crimes, it was something else. It was a symbol of possibility, of redemption, or perhaps just a reckless bid to take control over one part of her chaotic life. She chose to implant herself with that embryo in secret. The procedure had been swift and unauthorized, veiled in falsified documents and hushed whispers within the walls of the underground clinic. For a while, Britt convinced herself it was a new beginning. But as her pregnancy progressed, so too did the complications in her personal life. Faison was becoming more volatile, his enemies circling, and his associates pressuring Britt for loyalty she could no longer feign. Threats began to emerge not only to her but to the unborn child. The closer she came to delivery, the more unstable her surroundings became. When a particularly harrowing betrayal threatened her safety, Britt fled, first abandoning the program, and then the hospital, and ultimately the child. It was Lulu who found her, broken, terrified, and clutching a baby she could no longer care for. The timing was as cruel as it was fateful. Lulu had recently lost her firstborn child in a tragic pregnancy complication that left her emotionally hollow and physically fragile. The grief had nearly consumed her, until Britt placed that infant in her arms. Britt confessed everything, the unauthorized embryo, the dangerous forces still watching her, and her decision to disappear. Lulu, paralyzed by sorrow and longing for motherhood, agreed to raise the child as her own. They would bury the past, shield the child from Faison's enemies, and keep the truth between them. Rocco would grow up in safety, even if it meant growing up in a lie. Years passed. Lulu loved Rocco fiercely. She created memories, milestones, a home that was filled with genuine affection. But beneath the love lay a dread that one day the truth would crawl from the shadows and undo everything. That dread became reality the moment Brook Lynn, unintentionally at first, began peeling back layers of history in her vengeful crusade. Brook Lynn's research triggered a wave of revelations, and in her pursuit to unearth hypocrisy, she had reignited a fire that forced Britt out of hiding and Lulu into confession. The impact on Rocco was nothing short of catastrophic. When he heard the full story, the initial numbness gave way to a disorienting, jagged pain. Everything he thought he knew about his place in the world shattered in an instant. He wasn't just the child of a loving, albeit overprotective, mother and a strong-willed, sometimes distant, father. He was the result of a stolen embryo, a scientific mistake, and a string of lies intended to protect, but ultimately disempowered him from owning the truth of his origin. The woman he thought had birthed him was not his biological mother. The woman who did birth him had abandoned him out of fear. And the man he called father, Dante, might not be his father at all. What twisted the knife deeper was Britt's own confession that she couldn't remember with certainty whether Dante was the genetic contributor to the embryo. Records had been manipulated, documentation lost or destroyed during the collapse of the fertility operation. At the time, Britt had believed the embryo was connected to Dante, based on labels and assumptions, but now she couldn't swear to it. There had been too many samples, too much secrecy, and no clarity. Which meant that even Rocco's paternity, something he had never before questioned, was suddenly unknown. Rocco left the house that day without saying a word. There was no screaming, no confrontation. Only silence and the hollow look of someone who had just been torn from his own identity. His face was pale, expressionless, eyes unfocused. Lulu tried to stop him, but he brushed past her, unreachable. The air around him was like ice, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel tethered to anything or anyone. Britt stood frozen, tears brimming in her eyes, unable to say his name. Dante arrived too late to stop the spiral, and when he saw Rocco vanish down the street without a backward glance, a silent panic overtook him. For Rocco, the absence of truth had become a betrayal more devastating than any single act of violence. He felt like an experiment, a mistake born of secrets and shame, shuffled between women who once made decisions for him without his consent, without his voice. And now, as the world he once trusted fell away beneath his feet, Rocco began to wonder if he had ever truly belonged anywhere. The foundation was gone. The family, fractured. The love he believed was unconditional now felt conditional on lies. He didn't go to school the next day. He didn't go to Gio, or Danny, or even Sasha. He sat alone in the abandoned garden behind the Quartermain estate, trying to piece together who he was without the stories others had written for him. The name Rocco felt foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. He looked at his own reflection in the rain-slick surface of a garden sculpture and didn't recognize the boy staring back. Meanwhile, back at the house, Britt sat beside Lulu in silence, both women too broken to speak. Brook Lynn stood apart from them, her arms folded tightly, the triumph she once sought now turned into ash. She had hoped to expose hypocrisy, to humble Lulu, to reclaim her own stolen motherhood by shining a light on someone else's lies. But all she had done was hurt a child. She had become the very thing she swore she wouldn't be, another adult manipulating a child's life for her own agenda. And somewhere in the distance, Rocco finally let the first tear fall, not for what he had lost, but for the realization that he might never know who he truly was. As Rocco disappeared into the unforgiving silence beyond the gates of the Quartermain estate, it was Gio who first sensed the gravity of the unfolding disaster. Still reeling from the shattering revelation of his own origins, Gio recognized the same vacant hollowness in Rocco's eyes that he had seen in the mirror only days before. It was more than just pain, it was the unraveling of identity, the quiet scream of a boy who had just discovered that everything he believed about his life was a lie. And for Gio, that recognition struck a chord too deep to ignore. Though still navigating his own emotional wreckage, Gio now saw with frightening clarity that Rocco, his younger half-brother, his blood, was being pulled into the same whirlpool of betrayal and confusion that had nearly destroyed him. Gio wasted no time. He found Brook Lynn alone, tucked into the corner of the Quartermain study, the shadows long and her eyes fixed on a folder she could no longer bring herself to open. Her expression was unreadable, a tight mask of control fraying at the edges. Gio didn't knock. He stepped into the room with the energy of a storm barely held at bay, and though he said nothing at first, the accusation in his eyes was louder than any words. She looked up, startled, but then her shoulders stiffened, defensive. Before she could speak, Gio did. He demanded she stop. Stop digging, stop hurting, stop using the truth as a weapon when its fragments were already cutting everyone to pieces. He pleaded with her to remember what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a revelation that shatters the soul. He reminded her that the truth, no matter how noble it may seem when unearthed, loses all its righteousness when it becomes a tool of revenge. But Brook Lynn, angry, wounded, and still bleeding from years of deception and loss, refused to yield. Her voice trembled not with guilt, but with the fury of someone who believed, perhaps desperately, that justice could only be achieved through fire. She believed Lulu deserved to pay. For the lies she told. For the role she played in keeping Joe's identity hidden. For the way she had positioned herself as the moral compass of motherhood while harboring her own devastating secrets. For manipulating Dante's affections, for stealing moments that Brook Lynn never got to have with her own son. And now, for the pain Rocco was enduring, Brook Lynn saw Lulu as the root of it all. In her mind, exposing Lulu wasn't cruelty, it was correction. But in her pursuit of justice, Brook Lynn had forgotten that vengeance has a cost, and she was beginning to pay it in the most painful currency of all, the trust and love of the very people she once sought to protect. Gio, unable to reach her through reason, left her there, alone, rigid, and blind to the path of destruction she had carved. As he stepped outside into the cool air of the evening, he knew Rocco wasn't the only one lost now. Brook Lynn, in her war against hypocrisy, had lost herself too. Elsewhere, Britt stood on the threshold of Dante's home, no longer the hunted, no longer the fugitive fleeing the consequences of her past. She was not the same woman who had once abandoned a child for the illusion of safety. Years of exile had weathered her, sharpened her remorse, and molded her into someone who no longer wished to hide. She held nothing but a small envelope in her hand, an attempt at explanation, at contrition, at something resembling peace. But when Dante opened the door and saw her standing there, he did not see redemption. He saw danger. He saw the ghost of a past that had already stolen too much from him. For Dante, Britt's presence was not a chance for closure, but a threat to what little remained of his family. He had just lost Rocco to a truth he had not prepared for, had failed to reveal in time. Now, the woman at the center of that truth stood at his door, her eyes filled with regret, but her very existence reminding him of everything he might still lose. The instinct to slam the door was primal. But something in her face, something unmistakably maternal and broken, kept his hand from moving. And so, the two stood there, suspended in a moment where the past and present collided with brutal force. Words escaped them. Forgiveness, if it was possible, had not yet taken shape. What remained was fear, and the quiet acknowledgement that the worst had only just begun. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Brook Lynn's crusade spread outward like a tidal wave crashing into the foundation of an already fragile family. What began as a mission to expose hypocrisy had transformed into a storm capable of destroying everything in its path. Each secret revealed did not liberate, it infected. Each truth, no matter how righteous, came too late and too violently to be anything but another fracture in an already crumbling foundation. And then came the silence. Rocco, swallowed by shame, confusion, and anger, disappeared. No one knew where he went. No one knew how far the devastation had taken him. All they knew was that he was gone, and in his absence, the hollowness echoed through every hallway of the Quartermain estate. Sasha found Daisy clinging to a photo of her cousin and asking why everyone was crying. Michael stood wordless in the foyer, trying to piece together how a family so big could feel so empty. Lulu locked herself in her room, unable to face anyone, not even herself. Dante wandered the streets, searching not just for his son, but for the sense of fatherhood he now feared he had lost. And Brook Lynn. She sat alone, still clutching the folder, finally opening it, only to find that the satisfaction she once imagined would come from the truth had never arrived. All she had left was the weight of having broken the very thing she had hoped to protect. Because in the end, this was never just about a lie. It was about what happens when love is buried beneath resentment, when pain is allowed to guide justice, when the truth is wielded not as a light, but as a blade. And as the family stood amidst the wreckage, fragmented, frightened, and uncertain, they began to realize that Rocco wasn't the only one who had vanished. Somewhere in the chaos, their sense of who they were to each other had gone missing too. The storm that Brook Lynn started had not only exposed the past, it had set fire to the future.